I'm just going to introduce myself briefly because I do want us to get to our panelists. So I'm Zeus Leonardo. I'm from the Graduate School of Education, which has a new building over there on Shattuck if you're interested in visiting. I'm also the recent associate dean there, so I wear a hat and a visor in the department. So just briefly, my research is in the area of race and class stratification. And if that's a hat and a visor, I wear a wristband in the critical theory designated emphasis. And I attend those meetings and have that community to be with as well. And so that's all I'm going to say about myself. I'm going to moderate today with some questions. And I'm going to just say their name for now, which is, I'm going to start with Rudy Mendoza-Denton to my left. And to his left is Claire Kremen. And then finally, to her left is Terry Johnson. So without further ado, this is Rudy Mendoza-Denton. If you just say a couple words about yourselves, and then we'll start with the questions to launch us.
Happy to be here today. I am a professor of psychology, of social psychology, and I was a graduate student at Columbia when Carol Dweck, who was the originator of mindset theory, I suppose, was there. And the other thing I can add is that I am in the same building as Zeus now, and I wear a full body suit.
Well, I don't know if I can top that one. I'm Claire Kremen. I work in the Department of Environmental Sciences, Policy, and Management. I'm a conservation biologist who works often in agricultural ecosystems, and I've been involved with setting up a couple of interdisciplinary centers, institutes on campus, including the Center for Diversified Farming Systems and then the Berkeley Food Institute. And I think I'm here because I really try hard to do participatory learning in my classes, and that's what I enjoy doing with teaching.
I'm a professor of bioengineering, their vice chair of undergraduate studies, and the faculty advisor for the Center for Teaching and Learning.
Okay, thank you. So we have precious time, and I believe we have this room till 12:30, correct, Jean?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to launch us, and we have some prepared questions, and we hope to get through them. There's 5 of them. And so rather than the presenters or the panelists presenting, we are wanting to carry on a dialogue so that the 3 people to my left are going to think about these questions for a couple seconds before they give us their knockout answers, so to speak. So the first one is, what is a growth mindset approach, right? And how is it different or similar or reacting to other theories of learning? So what is it? How is it different, similar, or reacting to other theories of learning? And this doesn't go in any order. They can volunteer their response.
I'll start with, I'm not even sure it's a theory of learning. It's just sort of a cultural meme, which is probably highlighted by shows like House and Sherlock, right? That people are freakishly good at certain things, and that is an inherent attribute of them. And I would say that this is particularly something that we have in natural sciences. The idea that there are certain skill sets that you either have or don't have. And that there are people that are very early on in their lives identified as good at a thing or not good at a thing. And the main issue is to push against that meme. I call it a meme because I don't think you can even elevate it to the idea of a teaching theory. I don't think that there's any there. But I think that it is a very powerful cultural force that a lot of our students come in believing that they're either good at things or bad at things. And I'll just use the example I always use. I've had a number of students tell me that, I don't really feel like I'm really good at math. And I'm like, you would need to study math for 7 lifetimes to figure out whether you are good or bad at math. None of you know whether you are good or bad at math. You could not possibly have collected enough data to do that. You may have heard that from other people, you may have convinced yourself of it, but you don't know it.
Well, I have to confess that I looked up growth mindset approach this morning on my phone and became overwhelmed and wondered what I was doing here, because I don't know a thing about growth mindset approach, and I certainly could not contrast it with other theories of learning because that's not my expertise at all. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to answer the other question that was on the sheet, which was how can we redesign our classrooms in ways that support lifelong learning, development of higher order skills, equity, and inclusion. And all I can do is talk about what I do. I can't answer it in a general way, but what I'm really excited about is a class that I work on with graduate students. It's a graduate level class where essentially I commission projects from non-governmental organizations, conservation organizations, and I ask them to give me projects that they really need to have done, that they don't have the time to do, that are complex enough that a small team of graduate students can do it. And I think the real wonderful thing about it is that that it's true, no one student can do it, and not only that, no one skill set can do it. The projects are usually complicated enough that you need a variety of people working together, and you need to blend these skills. And it's sort of magical. I've been doing it now for 3 years. These teams come together and they usually go beyond our expectations. Usually I'm trying to back the NGO staff's expectations. I'm trying to walk them back. This is a semester-long project. Don't make it too complicated. But then in the end, the students will take it in a different place, and that's always super exciting. So I think that's an example of a way to create this sort of higher order skills. I think that it's a very affirming process for the students because they're learning a lot and they're doing something that people need. And these products that they've been producing get used, and that is just really, really affirming. Plus, they get some networking, and they've worked with one another, and there's a lot of team learning as well, or learning how to work on a team, and it's just very real world. And so it's just been really, really exciting, and I would love to figure out how to get that into more of an undergraduate format, but I haven't figured that out yet. So I'd love to talk about that maybe later on if anybody has experiences trying to do that kind of thing. So I hope I didn't take it way down in the wrong direction, but that's sort of what I feel I can contribute.
I'm happy to contribute just one more thought, which is that if the concept itself, I think it's a fairly straightforward concept. I agree with Terry. It's not a theory of learning per se, but rather it's a theory about how people think about, in this particular case, intelligence. Do you think that intelligence is something that you can grow and develop with work over time, or do you think it's something that you're born with and that doesn't change? And that just has a number of implications for how you then approach learning. Do you, if you get a bad grade on a test, does that then suggest to you as a growth theorist? We used to call that incremental theorist. Like if you believe it's that your intelligence can grow and you get a bad grade, your orientation towards a bad grade changes, and it suggests where you can work, as opposed to being a signal that that you are in fact unable or unintelligent, etc. It also has implications for how you approach tasks, so that if what you're concerned about is showing that you are in fact intelligent, you tend to choose less demanding, less sort of pushing you to the limit kinds of tasks. Whereas if you are supposedly a growth mindset theorist, so it's a theory about the theories that you have. Just to finish that thought, if you're a growth mindset theorist, you're more likely to go for what's difficult. So growth mindset in the domain of intelligence has implications for how you approach learning, how you react to feedback, and then the kinds of opportunities that you seek. You can have different theories as well, for example, about personality, right? So do you believe that personality is a fixed entity or something that you can grow? The only other thing I want to add to Terry's point is that it is not a theory of learning, but it does more than a meme. I think it's a culturally based sort of understanding that communities tend to share. There's a paper in Science by Simpian and colleagues in 2016, and what they did is they asked academics across many different departments how much they thought that genius, right, or brilliance, inborn brilliance, was required to be successful in the field. And the fields that came out at the high end were philosophy, physics, and math. And then it kind of goes, psychology's here, education is sort of up here. And the reason I'm putting this space for you is that what they graphed against it was the diversity in the field in terms of the numbers of women and the numbers of underrepresented minorities. And that relationship was really strong and really linear, so that the more people think that genius is needed in the field, the fewer women and minorities there are in the field. That's actually part of what I study. What it tells me is that it's not just about the person's own beliefs, but the mentor's belief about who is good and who is bad, like the counselor saying you're not good at math, or you go here. People have these beliefs, and then they tend to steer people towards culturally stereotyped careers and paths that probably have nothing to do with the ability of the person per se. So it's a theory, but it's mediated, I think, through these really interesting and complex social interactions and processes of feedback and reward that students are given.
This is great. I mean, these are as well my impressions. I mean, I'm in education, and math is one of the few places where we actually talk about the math gene. So that being good at math is somehow innate versus writing well. I mean, there's other kinds of assumptions about that too, but we don't talk about a writing gene. We talk about a math gene, for example.
And speaking as a bioengineering professor, there is no math gene. We're pretty dang sure about that one.
Exactly. So I'm saying it tongue-in-cheek. So that has become a source of the problem, especially with respect to equity and other issues we deal with and care about. So this hooks into smartness, intelligence, and other such loaded terms, since dating back to some of the eugenics studies. So, but this is Berkeley. And we pride ourselves for being a place that values smartness and intelligence. How does this work at a place like Berkeley? And how might a growth mindset be difficult or easier to promote here at Berkeley? And I think Claire has already begun talking about how she tries to do that in her practice in classroom.
I'd love to hear more from Claire about how that is practiced in your.
Well, I mean, I think that, so with the teams, I asked them to fill out at the beginning of the class a sort of a self-assessment of their various skills, because these projects do require some basic skills or certain skills, and I try to assemble the team so that they'll be able to accomplish it. And as I mentioned before, not everybody, it's sort of interdigitating between different people's skills. So I think there's probably a whole science to building these teams that I don't know. So I've just been doing it, by the seat of my pants, but it's pretty much working. So they fill out the skills assessment, and they also learn about all the projects that are available. There's 5 or so projects per semester, and they rank them according to their interests. And that's a really interesting thing, because some students, you can see here's their background and it matches perfectly with the project, and that's the project they want to do. And other students, it's the opposite. Here's their background, which would match perfectly with one of the projects which I wish they wanted to do to make that project really work. But no, they want to do a different project because they want to learn new skills. So yeah, I think maybe that's some of what we're talking about, that some people want to just find new skills to add to what they've already got, and other people want to use the skills they've already got. And yeah.
Can you share with us some examples from your self-assessment, the kinds of questions you ask the students?
I mean, they are somewhat on the technical side. I do, oh gosh, I wish I had it in front of me, but depending on what the list of projects are, I'll ask them, for example, do you have any, what classes have you taken in these basic fields? Do you have geographic information systems? How's your statistics? They're fairly technical, but I also ask about writing, project management, communications, visualization. So I try to give a range because I also want students to feel comfortable. I don't want a student to kind of go down the list and go, oh, I don't have anything to offer. So I ask about, because it's a conservation class, usually I have students who have knowledge of different aspects of ecology, so I'll say like vertebrate ecology or plant ecology. So students, I have never had a student who didn't have some of these things. But I also make it really clear to them that it's not, this is not a test, this is to help match and build the teams. The other thing that's a little bit problematic is what if you have a team where one person is really, really advanced and strong and the others are not? How will that work? And I've grappled with that a little bit.
Can I ask a question, and it's actually a question for you, sir, which is, why do you ask about the assessment? And this is, by the way, this is a very deliberate strategy for me to turn it back to the group so that we can engage the conversation.
I ask because I'm trying to understand growth mindset as being something that might be a phenomenon that's contextualized. That is that a person might be highly motivated to do something based upon what they've experienced and done in their lives. And relatively simple, and so I wondered, what were the questions you were asking on the self-assessment, and it's interesting that you also began by saying you have some students who obviously gravitate towards what they already know and have experienced, but you also have those who gravitate towards what they don't know and have not experienced. That to me is fascinating in terms of trying to understand growth mindset and how life experience factors into what motivates a person.
Yeah.
Do you happen to do any post-project assessments as well?
I do, yeah. So this kind of gets into the part about assessment, and so I have all of the students on the team do a self-evaluation where they evaluate what they contributed, but also in part of their self-evaluation is to sort of say what each team member contributed, and then what they contributed, what did they, I think that one of the questions is what they hoped to gain and what did they gain. So it's somewhat more of a personal reflection on their experience through the process, but it also helps me to triangulate a little bit because each of the members is talking about what each person contributed. And so if that's really not coherent, then there's a problem, but if they're all kind of saying the same thing, and so far they've always pretty much all said the same thing. And a couple of times those self-evaluations did surface some problems that the groups were having. But we do a lot of check-ins along the way as well, so I try to keep tabs on what's going on.
I just want to add, I do pre and post assessment, so or reflection. So before they really have worked a lot as a group, they're just sort of getting into their group. Everybody identifies how they want to develop professionally as part of the experience, and then part of the post-reflection is what they actually did to do that. And there's also some evidence that the outcomes are a little more equitable when before people just sort of glom into the group and unmindfully assume roles, that the work is sort of better split and people get more out of the projects if they kind of have a I want to do this, and I'm going to be asked if I did it at some point.
Thought I saw a hand back there and then a hand over here.
Well, I was just wondering, you asked in that evaluation what sparked, why do you want to be on this project?
Sorry, you asked me?
As part of that first assessment.
Yeah, at the very beginning, they do the skills assessment, they do the project ranking.
Yeah.
So I asked them to rank the projects, and there's a little comment section so they can say if they want, and that's definitely really helpful. The ones who say, I'm desperate to do this project because of such and such. I try really hard to, I always try to give them within their top, really 2 choices if possible. But that comment really does help. I was going to say also that I also, early on, I do some, there's a whole session where the groups think through the process of working together. They have some worksheets to help them with that. What sort of ways do they want to communicate with one another, and how do they want to split the work, and those kinds of things. And that's really helps a lot.
It makes
with the
such a
process.
difference.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think part of the question there, and it's a question that I share with you, is I wonder if you could make transparent for us. I believe you've done this a little bit, but in your answer to the first and the second assessment, and how does that embody or configure a growth mindset if you see it in that way? Like, what is it? How is that relevant to this session? And I just want to make that super transparent.
Really, it's just the purpose of this is for you to develop, right? I'm not giving you an assignment because it is a torture that I experienced previously, and have determined that you will feel as well. That partially they should take some responsibility for their development here. There's many things you could do in this project. One of the things I want you to be thinking about is, how do you want to develop? There's a bunch of different options. You'll be forced to develop. That's the goal, right? But to participate in a plan for growth.
So one of the things that you can, that you can begin to see is that the growth mindset, it's not just existing within the individual, but in what the structure itself of the pedagogy begins to suggest to the student. Because I struggled with this. I struggled with assessment a lot, because if there's one thing that communicates fixed mindset is the test at the end, right? So how do you work it so that you're communicating, not just saying but showing that you have this, that you're behind this development of the student as opposed to assessment. That's part of my interest in assessment. And I'll also say I'm really interested in, you should ask him also, not just as a moderator, but as an educator, how he manages that in the classroom. Sorry.
And we will return to this, because not only is it one of the planned questions here, but I think it's deservedly attracting interest in the group. But I do have a question from the back. Yes, sir.
Yeah, it was about kind of skills and what's showing up in terms of what the students value as a skill, what they even identify as being a skill that could be developed or that they could have, and then what's missing from that. So imagine, there's probably a fair amount that say programming in Python as a skill, but do any of them list empathy as a skill, or skills that may not be located in an individual, but like, our team has a skill that's collectively a skill, but is not something inherent to the individual itself.
I think that suggests maybe that the skill assessment tool could be more open-ended. Although if it was more open-ended, I wonder how many students might say something like empathy. I don't know. I'm not sure how to elicit that unless you put it on there. So.
I think what we're trying to grapple with is not just what this thing is, but what does it implicate as far as our teaching and as far as our understandings of what it means to learn. And I'm kind of going off on what Rudy's suggesting here, is that is it about a condition, not whether we as individuals accept or don't accept the growth mindset, but how do we create conditions, for example, to empower a student, right? I don't necessarily like to say I'm empowering students, but I'm setting up a condition, a teaching condition, a classroom condition that hopefully is empowering. But I don't like that kind of way of thinking about empowering students, that I'm doing this for you or to you, right? So I perhaps to sort of answer your involving me in this is how does this, so it's also one of the questions here, how does this impact our learning, our teaching? What are the challenges? What are the possible options we have that's created, but what are the difficulties and struggles we might have in thinking about growth mindsets for ourselves?
I have to ask this question, which is that one of the things I find myself reacting to in your comment is, okay, we're gonna have this coding in Python, and that's this skill, and then you're contrasting that with, but how do you do something growth mindset-y related like empathy? And I'm not sure if I got that right, but it seemed like you were saying, okay, there's these like soft skills, and that maybe. Am I misreading that you're thinking that that's growth mindset versus like coding, which is somehow not? Or does empathy encourage growth mindset? What's the relationship between Python and empathy and growth mindset?
Yeah, so it's what do people see as skills? Like, so if we're asking them about skills, what do they even see as a skill that they could develop?
Oh, okay.
Do they see empathy as a skill? So is that showing up, or is that something that isn't in the realm of skills?
So if I'm channeling the growth mindset crew, and you were like a graduate student in the lab, I'd say that's a great idea. People probably have a theory about whether you are an empathic person and there's nothing you can do about it, or whether you can develop and grow your empathy. And that's not, depending on what people think about personality, it has these incredible effects on how you treat another person. If you, for example, have a theory that your prejudice is inborn and fixed, you're much less likely to be receptive to prejudice reduction interventions, right? So the theories can be specific to domains, and I am guessing that the empathy thing probably doesn't have a whole lot to do with whether you believe that you are good at like computey stuff, or like at coding, or whether you think it's a growable skill.
Yeah, I think of it less in the context of empathy and coding in Python, but more in working in a team. What are all the skills valuable in a team?
Right.
Definitely a valuable skill.
I think so. Part of the job, and it's not perpendicular, but maybe not parallel. Like, part of the job is to just make them understand that there are a much wider set of skills associated with your discipline than most of them enter thinking, right? So I'm engineering. They come in hyper-focused on technical skills. And I spend a lot of time telling students, that's great. You can be a great technician. But if you want to be an engineer, you need judgment. And judgment is hard and not necessarily quantitative, so you'll hate it for about a year and a half. But at the same time realizing or communicating, right, either directly or through process, that all of these things are trainable, right? I teach some engineering ethics or responsible engineering courses as well. And like the first day is that I'm going to assume that you all want to be good people, right? But the goal is to understand that being a good person in this discipline is hard, right? It is a skill that you need. You can have great intentions, and we'll go through some cases. Not great outcomes. And I'm going to assume you all want to do good through your careers. And the goal is to make you understand how hard that is. That is something that you will have to devote time and energy to. Like being pure of heart will get you this far.
So it sounds like clarifying the skill sets that you need in your particular course of pedagogy that extend beyond the formal like learning of Python. Like these are the skills you will need for this. That begins to set up a space, and maybe we can talk about how you frame things early on. I'm really sort of grooving with Zeus, saying that you have a lot of responsibility in terms of the conditions that you can set for encouraging that approach, rather than than focusing the locus of the growth or fixed theory within the student themselves. Something like that.
I mean, so we're trying to weave in and out of these questions and sharing our own experiences. Part of it, we mentioned intelligence, smartness. The other one is expertise, right? And so I teach a lot of material on race, anti-racism, and I'm about to be on a panel tomorrow on equity pedagogy as part of the joint medical degree with UCSF in here and there. And I'm starting to learn about the medical group where expertise is so important. So when you talk about race, particularly I like to talk about whiteness in the classroom, that when white students, professors, and other medical professionals run into this problem, they feel like they're not experts as whites about things such as race or anti-racism because they assume whites don't have that experience or knowledge. And it's turning up particularly interesting in the medical field where expertise, because expertise can mean life and death, right, in the medical field. And that's running up into a particularly specific issue with respect to teaching equity pedagogy, race, and in my case, teaching white students and professionals about race. And they don't feel they have it as whites. And there, I think growth mindset will really be advantageous, so that folks don't think that just because they're white, they don't have expertise, and they're going down the opposite road we're trying to take them in, which is you can grow into this, you can learn the skills, and i.e. expertise. So I guess I'm trying to invoke the other related word to intelligence and smartness, which is expertise. That's so interesting in a place like Berkeley. We all try to train people to be experts in their field. And so how does that's part of the question, I suppose, is we're not doing this in a vacuum. We have a social structure, at least here at the university. We have reward structures, incentives. And so how does teaching this way necessitate a shift in how we carry on our incentive systems, or even our tenure files and folders, our teaching evaluations, etc. So that's the question I'm going to throw to the panelists is, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. We are in a place. We are a global, world-class university. What is our reward incentive like?
I will. If I may, can I take that? Just because I've struggled with this for so many years, which is that, I've always been of the, since I was a grad student, of the growth mindset persuasion before it even took off. But as I shared, testing, right, and the midterm and the final, they're so fixed, and it's just a context in which you as a student have been trained and reinforced to ask me, what can I do to get an A on the test? And so, so there's things that I do, we can talk about them, including I don't give letter grades until the very, very end. They really object to that. I refuse to answer questions on how they can, what they can do to get an A. I try my hardest not to frame it in that way. And there are things that I do to give people credit for incrementally done work. So those are the embodiments of incremental work, but they are still being assessed with A's and B's and C's, living in this context of essentially what ends up being an ordinal assessment of your expertise, or, your value, your quality, etc. And it drives me nuts. And I still don't know how to live in assessment the growth condition.
Yeah, I really struggle with assessments. I hate the idea of testing. I don't like it at all. But of course, I want the students to learn. So what I try to do in my undergrad classes is I try to make the tests a learning experience. I don't give any in-class tests anymore. They do take-home tests. I make those questions. They're somewhat open-ended. I mean, they can go in different ways with them. So they're all kind of researchy types of questions. But in the end, I have to grade them. So yeah, that's still happening. Same with the final project is very much, they get lots and lots of help along the way with defining that question, and lots of peer review and review by the GSI, review with me, so that by the time we get the end product, it's usually pretty good. That really helps because then I get to read papers that are reasonably good. So then the grades are, I think it helps the grades be better. But yeah, in the end, there's the assessment. I just want to go back to the grad class again. That one, I think I really feel really good about it because, I mean, yes, I have to give a grade, but the grade is kind of irrelevant. I mean, the students are working for this project. They want to do it. They want to, and they're working with each other, and they want to show their contribution to each other. There's another part of the class besides the team-based learning. They also, each student is in partnership with another student leads the class one time, and so that involves with working with me on picking readings, and then also they do all of the constructing of group exercises. And again, I mean, they're just so motivated because they're up there in front of the other students. I think that's what's motivating about the class is its real world nature and their exposure. They're out there. And so the grades are they're irrelevant. They're all, I mean, in the end, they all get A's, I think, pretty much. It's just hard to imagine a student not, unless something really happened and they couldn't come to class at all, they couldn't participate.
So isn't that funny that usually we think the mark of the good teacher or the teacher is that there will be like a distribution of grades, right? And if you don't have that distribution, you either force a distribution or something, and if not, something is wrong and you are being too easy or something. And that is just so weird because if you're doing your job, everybody should get an A,
Yeah.
right? So again, I struggle with that.
I
Sorry,
just want
Susan.
to point out the really big distinction between graduate level classes and undergraduate classes. I think that's getting glossed over here a little bit, and I think that the grades as a thing is much more of a big deal in undergraduate education. So like I appreciate hearing about the graduate classes, but I'm also interested in hearing about how do we combat this growth, this fixed mindset idea at the freshmen and sophomores in college level. That's not just, well, everybody can work towards getting an A, because that's not what's going to happen in my class. Not everybody is going to manage to learn all of the material in the time frame that they're given and with the amount of things that they have competing for their time and everything. I feel like there's things about how the grading structures are set up that are not as big a deal for the graduate level. So I'm interested in hearing more about undergraduate course setups too, if that's okay.
So there's a couple things that I teach 2 large undergraduate courses. One's around 250, one's around 100. I don't know if 100 is large anymore. I don't know if the dynamic range has shifted. And I think that there are some things that you can do. I think looking at the deliverables that you have in your courses, and I'm very big in looking into those percentages, right? Exams are effectively hot takes, right? They reward people that are quick and not necessarily deep. So trying to give opportunities in classes where students have multiple different types of deliverables to engage with, I think is one potential way of doing it. You can always, and I know some people have done this, set up a class where there's 1,000 points in the class, and if you get above this, you get this grade. And if everybody gets above that, you get that grade. And that's a way of sort of structuring a class such that there's anti-competitiveness. I never have a strict curve where, no matter how good you all do, this many of you will get C's. I think that that's a really simple thing that you can do structurally. I think too, so that there's the structural part. A lot of that is in the syllabus and the B courses and how you set things up and how you sort of design various aspects of the class. But then a lot of it is embodiment and language. So when you talk, I think number one, talking as little about evaluation as possible just de-emphasizes its importance to you. The more you talk about grades, the more the students want to talk about grades, and the less you're talking about the stuff in the class. So I try to have kind of a wall up. There are opportunities for regrades, but only under very particular circumstances, which are impersonal, right? That's an example. I try not to use the word smart in my classes. I may use it to describe an act or an output, but never a person, right? Like I might go, oh, that's smart, right? But I try to even avoid doing that because I feel like that's an issue. To emphasize that evaluation is where you are at a certain point, right? That you're not, just to say, yeah, you got a B, right? That does not mean that you will never have an A level of knowledge in this thing. It just means that you have some more stuff to learn. And I think there are some really simple things for embodying. One, we're not all geniuses. I'm not. I was tested as a child. I have a piece of paper. It doesn't matter, right? I think that there is a real feeling among academia, like, well, we're academics. We're the smart ones. No, we're just the people that have been thinking about these sorts of things for decades, right? That's it. And we tend to have thought a lot about things that have a certain cultural cachet to them. Does not mean that they are, outside of the realm of mere mortals. They're certainly not. It just means that I've thought about other different things than other people have thought about. And making it very clear that it is based on experience. I will routinely tell my students, no, I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. If I did not know some stuff, it would be pathetic, right? This is something, I want you to imagine your entire lifespan being spent continuing this thing. You will get really good at things that I am not good at. You need to understand that. You need to not judge yourself by the graduate students or the professors, because of course they're better at you than these things. They have more expertise, and it's hard won. It's time spent, right? And sharing failure. That's the last thing that I want to say. Very few students get through a class without hearing about my experience in graduate thermodynamics. And it's a funny story, but more importantly, they understand that I'm not automatically good at these things. I taught thermo 2 years ago. It does not mean that I came out of the womb, going delta S always gets bigger. That's not how it works. And in K through 12, they're so identified and shuttled and sent to particular classes and basically stratified in terms of skills, that this is not natural. K through 12 has programmed them to think a certain way about skills and talent and ability. And there's a lot of things I think that we can do to de-emphasize the aspects that are fixie and to emphasize the aspects that are growy in terms of our classes.
I want to share a story, but first I just want to say that one of the things that, I think rather than sort of saying, the graduate classes are a different animal, let's talk about, undergraduate. Maybe what I find helpful is to say, okay, what conditions do we have now in this graduate, context that are reasonably transferable to what is it that we're doing, or what's the collegiality like? What is it? And so there's that thing. And so having said that, let me share a story with you. I promise you, totally real, from yesterday. Saturday, because today's Tuesday, right? Sunday. My son is having this incredibly difficult time. He basically can't do a coding problem that's in his class, and he had this total meltdown. And he's 13. He had this total meltdown because he couldn't do it. At the root of that meltdown, and we are like growth mindset family, like when we were coaching him, do we care about the score? No, what do we care about? Playing the game, blah 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 blah. All that, really, but he's a fixed mindset theorist. I don't know how, but that's how his whole thing was like, I can't do it, and people are gonna think that I'm not smart, and it was mediated through this feeling that somehow he was letting us down, that he was that he was going to be perceived as not competent. And I think we're getting better at his meltdowns being shorter, his recovery periods appearing sooner. But there is that concern. So there's I don't know why I feel compelled to share that with you, other than to say that it's not like we're going to magically say, I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, and like my kids like yeah, but am I going to be perceived smart?
Mm-hmm.
And
I think it's actually, am I no longer going to perceive smart? Because it's having it taken away,
Right.
That you have the glowing crown of smartness above your head.
And
but if you fail, oh, I'm sorry.
And that's something that we definitely deal with at Berkeley. Gets back to the question here of what are we that orientation leads my son to pick problems that will reify his status as intelligent or good at coding, right? But the conditions have to be right, or what are the conditions that will allow him to explore those new boundaries? And those conditions are not in here. I'll tell you that.
That does come up in some of the more difficult conversations we need to have. And the way it's on the paper is this, but I'll add to it. I mean, so I'm in education, and we can sometimes talk about public education as being privatized, for example. The charter schools, the voucher system, etc., is a way down that road, and that will not favor marginalized students. Okay, that's one. So privatization, right? Bad for marginalized students. But I look at public schools, many of which are also not helping marginalized students. So it's not just against privatization and pro-public, or publicization, I suppose, is the opposite of that. If you don't ask certain questions, the same people could be hurt by both privatization and publicization or public schools. In fact, I'll venture that, right, if you are a family of color, public schools may not be your haven. In fact, I know many public school districts in this country that are being sued because of how they treat Black students, Latino students, Oakland being one of them, etc. And that's not saying Oakland is a bad place. I'm just saying that public school isn't necessarily the haven if you don't ask other questions or change other things about it. Therefore, that's sort of my critical race theory hat coming on there for a minute. So, for example, in critical race theory, we talk about this concept of interest convergence. Let me explain that by the example of the growth mindset. So we have this on the heels of things like grit, right? There's a literature on that. Resilience, there's a literature on that. Risk-taking, etc. Right? How is growth mindset, based on my earlier example, going to demarginalize some students if certain conditions, as Rudy said, aren't met, if certain criteria are not part of our plan, so that it can hurt the same people that the fixed mindset theory of learning and such already hurt? So that's a hard question for us to think about, is this sounds fine and dandy, but if other questions aren't asked or aren't in the room, could this, just like grit and resilience, could this be equally problematic, even though it sounds really great? So what are some of the criteria, other questions we might want to ask of the growth mindset so that it doesn't interestly converge with dominance? And
before venturing an answer, can I just ask you, Zeus, to help the group acquire a little more common ground? What is, people might say grit is great, it's a, like you're giving people, you're identifying this thing that is good for people. What's wrong with grit? What's wrong with resilience? It's what it's about. People, taking themselves up by their bootstraps, and you encourage that. So just help us understand how that is problematic, and then why is that, and then maybe we can talk about how growth mindset can.
Yeah, I think that things like grit and resilience are great, and we teach our own kids to have them. I certainly do. I have 2 young ones. All else being equal. That's sort of the magic part of that, is all else being equal, grit and resilience are some things that we would otherwise just teach our children or our students. But all else being equal is, in some eyes and in some research, is not what exists. And so that's why grit and resilience can run into problems, even though I would be the first to teach them to my own children. But that's why they might be a problem for us. Therefore, we could think about how growth mindset is great, all else being equal, right? So that's what the problem of grit appears like to some people, is that it can sometimes unintentionally defocus us on structural problems we're having, so that grit, as great as it is, has to meet and ask certain other questions about the structure that we're in. So that's the potential problem of grit. Therefore, what are the potential pitfalls and problems of growth mindset? And therefore asks us, what questions do we have to insert in our conversation? And I call that interest convergence after Derek Bell, right? So that Brown v. Board, for example, was great. It desegregated our schools. But certain questions weren't asked of Brown, and it converged in interest with an old standing interest of white communities and white families. So how do we avoid the growth mindset theory, etc.? How do I avoid that from falling back on the interests of what's already dominant? Let's go this way and then that way.
So this is not an answer, but it's an idea from some of the grit stuff, and that was a question I had. So I'm very interested maybe in something for undergrads, is this beginning of the class reflection and helping students have the skill inventory, or like what the matrix you expect to be teaching is, and let them self-rate and what's their self-chosen goal. But so about the grit, I just think effort is this thing, and how do we measure our own effort, and how do we give credit or reward effort based on what they really have to bring to it, like if it's not all things being equal. So it feels like that's a missing component of our self-evaluation, our self-assessment and our outside assessment that could, I don't know, that's one idea that I was
But let me ask you, okay? And this is a we know each other, so I feel safe. If I just tell my son, you just need to try harder, like and that's very gritty, like man up, son, kind of like what's missing from that? What is it what's missing from that?
Well, I think you have to think through what effort means. I mean, one can reflect on one's effort by whether it's amount of time, or did I do more of this than I did surfing Facebook? I don't know. Help them think through what effort do I have to bring to this? And so therefore, what can I accomplish? I don't know. And then if I'm in a really big class but I have a smaller GSI, like are we in those smaller groups reflecting and doing a midterm self-reflection? Okay, I need to readjust my goals. I don't know how that figures into the end with their final grade, but
Okay, so we have something here that's very resonant with what our other panelists are saying, which is that you're making, rather than making assessments about the individual, you're making assessments about what's needed, maybe the time that's needed. What else? And this is Terry's, this is what Terry said. What would you say to my son? What do I need to do to help him?
Can I say one other thing about effort I wanted to say about undergrads? Because I work at the health service, and so around health issues, I feel like in some groups more than others, you are not allowed to look like you're working hard. So this even when effort is of course fundamental, but in this work hard, play hard, I don't know, it's just very nuanced and finesse. Sometimes you have to be the most stressed out person in the room to get the points, but you actually can't really reveal to people how hard you're working. And so therefore, I guess that's the other important piece about effort. How do we see it? How do we understand it? How do we self-measure it? And how do
That's
we
powerful.
report it?
I mean, that's sort of how people talk about Roger Federer in tennis. He almost does it effortlessly. Michael Jordan is his comparison, right? That's interesting, that the idea of grit and efforts. It's very specific. And I do want to get to your question, and then we have...
Well, to follow up on this notion of effort, which I want to bring back around to this notion of growth mindset, is who are the other people involved in this individual's life who you're talking about regarding effort? I think it's important that maybe we think about effort in the context of other people. And actually, it was Professor Johnson who made me start to think about growth mindset. Most motivations, theories of motivation, are grounded in the individual. But we don't think about intelligence, for example, as a social phenomena. Rather, we don't think about it as a social phenomenon, we think about it as an individual phenomena. And I, as a bioengineer, certainly you must recognize that achievements in engineering often are done by groups, not individuals. And so that reshapes how we think about intelligence.
Always now. Yeah, like post 1770.
But growth mindset theory is grounded in the individual. So perhaps some of what we're struggling with, you're making a furrow in your brow there, so perhaps I have it wrong.
No, I'm into it.
That maybe we need to rethink how we think about something like growth mindset theory, rather than grounding it in the individual, thinking about our community of learners. When a student is struggling with an issue of motivation and appearances of motivation, my first inclination as an educator would be to get that student to connect with their teacher in that course or other students in that course as a way to engage and motivate them. Nobody is motivated in a vacuum.
But I mean, I think, okay, I know you don't want to talk about the graduate course.
I didn't mean to say I didn't want to hear about the graduate
But the
course. I was
team
just
thing.
also interested
No,
in
the team thing is really, I think this is, you can do this in undergraduate classes
You can,
too.
yes,
Maybe not,
yeah.
and I do it in my undergrad class, but maybe not quite as real worldy. But I think that's that's how I motivate the teams. When you go out to work in conservation, you're never going to be doing something just on your own. You're always going to be working in a team. This is how we work. And so it's intrinsically motivating, I think. And so, I think, Rudy, you asked us, how do we bring this into the undergraduate class in a real way?
That goes back to
these,
Jean Lave's work, communities of practice as a way of
Yeah.
thinking. When you feel like you're a legitimate member of some activity or some group, you become highly motivated in those settings.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Then we'll go.
So two quick things. One, I would say you can, in preparing students to work in teams and in groups, also prepare them to understand that they will accept different roles within those groups and that is healthy. They're not always leading the group. Engineering loves leadership training and it drives me bonkers. Because if you've ever had a team full of leaders, you know exactly how effective that team is.
Right.
But also things like if you go to a study group, look, some of the study groups, you are going to be more behind than anyone else in that group. And they're going to benefit from explaining their ideas about the material.
Learning, yeah.
They're going to benefit talking to you. Some days you'll be the one who's ahead, right? But don't feel like you only engage with other people when you're ahead. In terms of the issues with effort, right, is that practically, right, in a very theoretical sense, in a theoretical sense, growth mindset, if you put in effort, you will get better, right? Practically, you may have situations where you will not get better fast enough given the amount of effort that you can put in this class to pass, right? Like that is a real situation. I think that it is naive to go, it's all about just putting in that extra. They don't have time, right? It's not necessarily purely effort-based, because many of them are making tremendous efforts that are ineffectual because they're stuck in this virtue grind where I'm putting in tons of time. It's not effective time because I haven't stopped to learn what effective time studying or learning is. So it's just emphasizing effort, I think, is an issue. I tend to think that a good way of thinking about it is you always want to have a plan for growth. it might not be the plan that the student wants. It may not be the plan that the student wants to hear. You may have a student in your class that, not due to their inherent ability to understand differential equations, but due to the fact that they were not prepared to take this class. They maybe chose it and didn't have the prereqs. And the right thing in that case is not to say, well, just do more effort. Sometimes the plan, and it is still a plan for growth, the plan for growth is you need to drop this class, you need to do this, and then this in the summer, and then I will see you again next year. And that's not easy to hear, and it's not easy to say, but that is still growth mindset. It's not, well, you failed, you're bad at this, right? It is emphasizing that, like, the student is here, the student wants to be here, how do we get you there? And it may not be easy.
You know what? The other thing about growth mindset that is that I just want to put in, it was part of, I was trying to help us think through it together, but I will tell you, and it's particularly hard with undergraduates, particularly when you have a large class. What do I tell my son? It's not, you just need to try harder and buck up. Part of growth mindset is I love you and I believe in you. And I believe that you can do better tomorrow. How that's weirdly social and yet intelligency, but so not. And that's part of the, I hear that message in, because the student has to be prepared to trust you when you say you need to drop this class, and that's so much easier with graduate students. So I just want to throw that out there as a nugget.
I'm just going to add really fast. Students that are crying in my office, which has happened, right? I'm head advisor. I have all of the first year undergraduates. One of the questions that usually I ask in the first 5 minutes is like, why did you want to be a bioengineer? And the answer is always the same. They wanted to help people, right? And then it's just a matter of going, good, we need people who want to do that, right? Like, we want you in this discipline. And I know that you're feeling a lot of pressure because you're getting a C in this class, right? But that does not mean that you should self-select from this thing that you want to do. Like, just accepting, like, you want to be in the discipline? Great. I want you to be in the discipline.
Thank you. I think 1, 2, and then G. By the way, we have about 13 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. I have a lot of thoughts going on in my head. I really appreciate you bringing up the social, not individual idea of intelligence, and I was thinking about that too. And one of the things that I think gets in the way is an idea of what counts as success, and that everybody has to be successful at this in the same way. Everybody has to get across the same finish line in the same way, and what you're measured against is where you're at in relation to the same set of goals. When in reality, once people are out of school, if they ever are, there's a lot of different angles that people take on the world. And so the question, I heard it put this way, which I have thought was really interesting, is instead of asking the question like, how smart are you, to ask the question, how are you smart? Mm-hmm. And so, Rudy, one of the things I've been thinking about with regard to your son is how do you say, not like, okay, you haven't gotten here yet, you can get there tomorrow, but where have you gotten? What is the part that you do understand? Where is your strength? Where is your skill? What can you contribute to a larger conversation around solving this coding problem? And so, and I don't know how to exactly translate that to a large undergraduate class, but I think we end up with these like really narrow lanes that make it hard to grow in all the different ways that people can grow. So that's one thing. And I also wanted to say I totally love your thing about I love you as a container around this. And to me, there's even a bigger container or a second sentence to that, which is not I love you because you're going to get there. It's like I love you wherever you get. And I know you can get there. because I think a lot of our students here have felt like their worth is dependent on how quickly or how far they learn. And how do we hold them and say, that's not what determines your worth. And you can still do it, but that's not, your worth as a human being is not about that. So,
Thank you.
In your prompt, Zeus, and I'm not sure I got it right, so that's sort of why I'm restating it back. It sounded like you were saying, on one hand, growth mindset is an opportunity to develop a more inclusive, more equitable classroom as a counterpoint to this notion of innate knowledge, right? That you're just saying that focus on where you need to go and improving yourself. But on the other hand, when you're talking about growth mindset or grit or resilience, access to your ability to sort of take risks, let's say, which is a common theme across all of those ideas, may be sort of impacted by broader social contexts. So just taking that approach of a growth mindset might by itself introduce inequalities, because people come from different places in society. So you need to sort of be mindful of both. You're both introducing opportunities, but perhaps barriers at the same time. Did I accurately capture where you were going?
Perfectly.
Okay.
I.e., let's be critical minds about growth mindset, which doesn't mean we reject or object to it, but what would our own critical growth mindset look like? Perfectly. Sorry. I think we have Jean and then you, and maybe we'll call it a day after you.
Well, I did also want to return to that question about how the conditions that we create are exacerbating or improving conditions for students of color. And I think it is funny how I think a lot of times when people talk about growth mindset, that becomes the new innate ability, right? That the innate ability to take risks and learn. And I think a couple of things. One, in the classroom, not just acknowledging that people have different abilities to take risks, but that the classroom itself constitutes different levels of risk depending on your experience and what you're coming in with. So even acknowledging, like, what does that look like in terms of a risk for a student can be very different depending on their experiences. And then I think also on the concept of effort, I think Carol Dweck also talks about this, that effort itself is not the point, that as an instructor, you are trying to get them to develop expertise. So it's not just try harder no matter what, but a lot of what makes success is actually having the right strategies. So understanding how do you point students, even with the best intentions and with a lot of effort, how do they develop the proper strategies to get that success? I mean, that's another piece of the puzzle and a role for instructors to play in terms of both acknowledging like the different awareness of strategies that students may have, and also just how you can then get all of your students to where they're, I think it is important to acknowledge that there isn't necessarily this measure of success that everyone's going to get to, and we should acknowledge where they are. But on the other hand, it is an institution where you want to advance and you want to get a degree and you want to get a good grade. So I think also understanding that there is a role in terms of, not innate ability, but having different strategies and having responsive strategies to the needs of those students.
And I think that comes back to just expanding the space of skills, right?
Yeah.
Like being better at strategic thinking and how you approach problems is not something that students they come in thinking, I'm going to do circuits, I'm going to do equations, but to make them understand like that's all in a book somewhere, right? Like you just go to the library. I'm not necessary for most technical skills. I teach them, but you don't need me. You kind of need me to tell you how you wrap them up and make judgment out of them. And that's the hard part, and the part that we really value.
Well, I think all of you are speaking to this point, about making that transparent for students.
Thank you. Last question or
Sure.
comment?
So I just want to start with saying thank you very much to Rudy, Claire, and Terry for what for me has been energizing conversation. I love the way it moved from just talking heads to more of a conversation. So I appreciate everybody's offered comments and questions. I am very curious about growth mindset from the POV, the person of color point of view, and curious to know, is there anybody out there, groups or researchers who are challenging or offering an alternative perspective around when we have inequitable systems within education, with just living, that don't allow for the safety of or the privilege of trying publicly or failing publicly for certain students, especially in the context of such a high achieving student population.
Yeah.
So I would love to learn, even if it's just the titles or the groups, the names. I would love to continue to read. I'm curious about who's poking holes in this theory.
I like to poke holes.
That's true. It's you.
Part of it is growing into what, right? Is the question. It's like if we don't look at the what, right? Perhaps we're actually asking students to have all this effort, have all this grit and resilience into a what that we don't look critically at, change, or we don't ask students to look at the what. And so they're succeeding at something that could be very much at odds with their own unhealthy, and other words we could probably use that are more sophisticated in this setting. So I think we have to look at the what, and that's what multiculturalism, for example, was about, right? So the what. So the other one is the standards of pedagogy, right? And now you're talking about the POC, POV, is that my understanding is that a lot of classroom pedagogies are, to invoke Jean Lave, which invokes Vygotsky, are based on a white zone of proximal development, a white ZPD. And so if we consider that that's what it means to grow, i.e. to grow into this potential learning as opposed to actual learning, the what in this situation is that the pedagogy is guided by white mindsets. So the growth mindset is a white growth mindset. That's not an indictment only, it's just my description of what I've found in literature and both empirical and theoretical. So if we want to poke holes in that, we have to ask, what does it mean to grow? Who is judged to have a mind? I.e. in education we call it who is educable, right? And so I've tried to poke some holes in that. I wrote a piece on whiteness and Vygotsky, or the white zone of proximal development, precisely that. And I think Jean invoked the idea of what does it mean to take a risk in a classroom. For example, if we talk about race in a public place like this or a classroom, often whites don't feel either the courage or they feel they don't have the expertise to take that risk and therefore hold back from there. So I think there are many ways we can look at this, to look at it through what you're asking, which is the POC, POV. And it's not poking holes just because it's fun to poke holes, but I think you're asking how can we do the growth mindset with equity in mind and other such things. I don't want to...
There's another sort of angle to it, which is that so we've covered this idea of the individualist, locating skills and within the individual, which ignores a social context, etc. What the social context perspective allows us to consider is that even if you have the best intentions for students with respect to growth mindset and grit, etc., etc., the way in which those opportunities are afforded and given to students themselves become inequitable, right? Or you're expected to do things and not to do things as a student, and not everybody has the same thing. So the way in which we enact our pedagogy, growth mindset as it may continue to be inequitable. So I think I like to think of ways in which we can distribute social and attentional, in terms of the mentors, resources, so that we are careful that we're not encouraging, let's say, the growth mindset of the men and not the women in STEM fields, because that's how it becomes enacted, and some really like compelling work that's also just come out of that same lab, showing that the boys and the girls self-select into. So these are messages that are early on. I think that's a complementary perspective on how the equity system kind of works. I'm really touched by when you said who feels, you know, when do you create an environment for people to feel like they can fail, and not everybody's afforded that same, you know, like it's much more costly for some people than others. So thank you for that.
And thank you all for joining us today. And one last moment to recognize the panelists. So thank you for convening us here and showing us how to grow as a group, not just individually. Thank you.